Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sefer Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Professor Ephraim Kanarfogel, who is the Billy Ivry University Professor of Jewish History, Literature, and Law at Yeshiva University. We'll be discussing a different Baal Tosfos, and we'll be discussing the Ohr Zarua, Rav Yitzchak of Vienna, and his classic Sefer Ohr Zarua. I want to mention at the beginning that this episode is being sponsored once again by a good friend of the podcast, Gluck Plumbing, service division. So for all your service needs in New Jersey, give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. So thank you, Professor Kanarfogel, for joining me once again.
It's a great pleasure, and thank the sponsor again. Thank you. Thank everyone. Thank the wonderful audience.
Okay, so let's start off. Tell the audience, who is the Ohr Zarua, Yitzchak of Vienna? When did he live? Who did he study under?
Good. So Rav Yitzchak of Ohr Zarua was born, it seems, or comes from what he calls Eretz Canaan. Where is Eretz Canaan? So a couple of ways to go. I'll do it quickly. Either Slavic lands, meaning close to Eastern Europe, what we might call Hungary or Bohemia, or Eretz Canaan, Hagar, again, a Shivcha. So it's another way of saying from what we would call we'll get yet tonight, unfortunately, to Ukraine in one little point, but not that far over, but somewhere, what we would call Bohemia, somewhere in that area. That's where he was born. However, he is what we call peripatetic. He went moving around. He not wandered, he didn't blunder, but he quite consciously learned first with several leading German Balei HaTosfos. The Ravia is one, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yoel Halevi. Ravia dies around 1225 or so. His even stronger German Rebbe, if I can say that, he refers to him as he lived in his house for a number of years, Reb Simcha Mishpira, who I've talked about, I think, on the podcast as the most important German Baal HaTosfos who's ever quoted by Tosfos. Again, the Ravia's big Sefer we have, Sefer Halacha, Sefer that goes on Shas too. Reb Simcha Mishpira, we only have pieces. He learned with them in Germany. He also learned with Rabbi Yehuda Chassid in Regensburg. So he learned with them in the Rhineland. He learned with Rabbi Yehuda Chassid in Regensburg. He's all over. He also learned, I'm not going to mention all the names, with several other German Balei HaTosfos and Rabbanim Chashuvim, including in Würzburg. It doesn't seem that he learned with Rabbi Elazar of Worms face-to-face, but he considers himself a Talmud. But wait, there's more. But then he goes to northern France, and he learns in Paris with Rabbi Yehuda Sirleon, who's a student of the Ri, a young student of the Ri, but a very strong student of the Ri, tells Rabbi Yehuda Chassid and Brachos and other things. And even with what's called, the one who's called Hasar Mikutzi, Rabbi Shimshon Mikutzi, uncle of the Smag. Anyway, his dates are approximately, and that's all we can do. He dies somewhere around 1250 or 1255. He's born somewhere around 1180 or 1185. But even from this brief survey, the Ohr Zarua, one of his calling cards is he's got tremendous material from the Balei HaTosfos in both Germany and northern France. So there's a mizug and a shiluv. It's not automatic, it's not set, but he will bring material from all of these rebbeim, from all of these centers. And if we can say, if we remember from our last podcast about the Mordechai died in 1298. So the Mordechai has the entire 13th century and before at his disposal. The Ohr Zarua has the first half of the 13th century. The Svarim are not dissimilar, but not identical. We'll talk about shortly. The Ohr Zarua works with topics, even though it's topics following Masechtas, but it's not a seriatim treatment of all of Shas. But in that very big Sefer, he's got Chomer from all of these Tzavot, all of these, places, everywhere and everywhere in between. I'll give some key examples. And so the richness of the material is remarkable. And as we'll see, he preserves stuff from France that we don't have otherwise. He preserves Chomer from Germany that we might not have otherwise, despite the fact that a lot of these Balei HaTosfos wrote and some of these things survived. So that's the basic contour of his lifetimes and geographic scope. And again, this wandering is, this is what Talmidei Chachamim did. They learned, one place, they went to the next Gadol, and so on and so forth. Also, very important point about the wandering. Again, if people remember from the podcast, I think especially one on Balei HaTosfos, in Rabbeinu Tam's day, Rabbeinu Tam dies in 1171, so he's earlier, just to give a perspective. In Rabbeinu Tam's day, many students came from Germany to learn with Rabbeinu Tam. They went back to Germany. So there's a lot of what we'll call cross-fertilization, pollination. After Rabbeinu Tam's death in 1171, that stops happening. I think mainly because the German Balei HaTosfos who learned with him teach his method in Germany. They don't come to France so much. That slows down, and it may have stalled. The Ohr Zarua is machadesh. He basically breaks what I like to call, what scholars in Israel call the netek, this separation period between France and Germany again. And he says, Chadesh Yamenu Kikedim, let me get myself, not only from the German Balei HaTosfos, let me get myself to Gedolei Talmidei Hari, and let me take as much French material back, put in my Sefer as I can also. So this is really his calling card. He's not simply a putter togetherer. He's a more active author, I would say, if I can say that, than the Mordechai, from whom we only hear once in a while, Ani HaMordechai, Ani HaKotten. The Ohr Zarua will say, Ani HaMechaber, and we'll talk about some of his own chiddushim as we go too.
Now I want to jump into two things. First of all, you mentioned Rabbi Elazar of Worms earlier. You're talking about the Rekech. That's the Rekech. Yeah, and another thing is, so how two questions about Ohr Zarua. How normal was it though for a Baal Toises especially to be such a wanderer? And second of all, you mentioned he came from like more Eastern Europe. I mean, how common was it in those days? We're talking 13th century.
Right. So 2 points. As far as the wandering, Rabbeinu Tam had a whole group of excellent Talmidim, the Rivam, Rav Ephraim of Regensburg, almost household names, who came from Germany, having learned with Rivav Shpira earlier. They came to Rabbeinu Tam. So again, in the earlier part of the period of Balei HaTosfos, this was quote unquote normal. It then stopped for a while. The Ohr Zarua starts it up again, and he's joined by others. Rami Rittenberg ends up learning in Paris. So in other words, later German Balei HaTosfos. So the answer is Big Gadol. It's very, very normal, right? Rashi, I think, got a pasuk in Shir Shirim about the Yonah, the Valgaring Talmidei Chachamim. They go from Beis Medrash to Beis Medrash. So, and again, even big distances. So there was a period where it was stopped. But the Ohr Zarua is dafka one of the, again, Chadesh Yamenu Kikedim. He starts up that system. Interesting question about Elazar of Worms, Elazar Sefer Okeach. I mentioned Yudah Chassid. An interesting question that we'll see here too. The Ohr Zarua is a Baal Halacha, and he will quote Rabbi Yudah Chassid in Halacha. He thinks he's a Baki in Hilchas Tefillin. He is. In other words, he'll quote him in Hilchas Tefillin. Rabbi Yudah Chassid had a specialty there, apparently. They have written about it. He will quote Rabbi Yudah Chassid on appointing a chazan more than Rabbeinu Tam, who he knows. Again, is that because a chazan Rabbi Yudah Chassid, is that a Torat HaSod? Is that a nigla? It seems to be a little bit of both. So there are times he will use the Chassidut, the Chassidus, and there are times that he doesn't. The Etzem HaSefer, the name Ohr Zarua comes up. Why is he known as the Ohr Zarua? Because apparently he had an issue about writing a get for a husband named Akiva. And the question was, how do you spell Akiva? With an aleph at the end or a hey at the end? Machlokas Bavli Yerushalmi, right? The Hebraicized version spells it with a hey at the end. The Aramaic version will spell it with an aleph. And he had a chalom. And in the chalom, Ohr Zarua, he dreamed a pasuk. What the Gedolim do in their chalomos? They dream a pasuk, right? He dreamed the pasuk, Ohr Zarua latzadik liyishlev simcha. The Sofei Tevos of that pasuk from beginning to end spell out Rabbi Akiva. And how does Akiva end in that pasuk? With the word simcha, the last letter of simcha, a hey. So apparently that gave him the impetus. He felt very close to that pasuk. And he opens this Sefer Halacha, coming back to Rabbi Elazar Okeach, because you mentioned it, he opens the Sefer Halacha with what's called an alpha beta. The alpha beta is a quasi-mystical perush on the Aleph Beis. Not exactly Sefer Yetzirah, not exactly Alpha Beta de Rabbi Akiva, but it is a mystical, or at least a quasi-mystical, a gematria and sod extension on the Aleph Beis, including material from Sefer Hechalot, the Hechalos, which we'll talk about, which some German Balei HaTosfos used quite a bit, maybe even a few French, but some Germans especially. So there's always a Hasidei Ashkenaz overlay here, but it's not the dominant strand, but it's again part of this picture. And I'll just make one final point. This alpha beta as the introduction very much mirrors what Rabbi Elazar Okeach did in his Sefer Okeach, Sefer Halacha, top to bottom. How does it start? Hilchos Chasidus, Hilchos Tshuva. Sounds a little bit like Sefer Hamada and the Rambam. So there's all kinds of interesting hashpaot here. But this is the Ohr Zarua is a German Balei HaTosfos, a student of German Balei HaTosfos, Gedolei German Balei HaTosfos, Gedolei Chachmei Tzarfat Balei HaTosfos, Chasidei Ashkenaz, both in halacha and in hashkafa. There are tremendous ramim here, and you have to always keep your eye on which strain is the one that he favors, and he picks and chooses as he sees the right way to go. Yeah, so that's as far as the Rebbe Lazar.
Now, now the question of what about the fact that it came from Eastern Europe? That seems pretty interesting for Baltaisif.
Good. Yes, I'm sorry. Correct. So there are communities already in these areas. I'm going to sound here like we'll do a little history lecture for a second. European Jewry in the 13th century is already starting to move from left to right. I don't mean that religiously. They're moving from Western Europe, the more Western parts of Europe, like Germany, in terms of the north. They're already starting to move a bit to the east. Europe is getting a little bit ausgespielt. First of all, there are some persecution issues in general, always there, unfortunately. But even just the land and the material. By the way, the non-Jews are starting to move too. So we tend to think, all of a sudden, all the Jews left Western Europe and they landed up in Poland. It's not quite so. There's a slow but steady move already in the 13th century. So when the reason that he comes from Eastern Europe to Western Europe to study, right, in Germany and France, is because Eastern Europe is not yet kolkach mefutach. They don't have great yeshivas yet. But he knows if he wants to learn, he's got to get himself over to the leading yeshivas. By the time he goes back to that area, he, of course, becomes toward the end of his life, not the very end, but later in life, the Rav of Vienna. Vienna was not such an Ir Ve'em B'Yisrael before he showed up there. There were Jews there, but I think he may be the first Zeir Choshev Rav of Vienna. He's succeeded there by Rebbe Victor Katz, who we've talked about, who was close to the Marami Rittenberg also. So once he gets back to Vienna, Vienna is already a place. And I'll mention a number of cases where he conducts business in East, does halachic business, learning business in that area. By the way, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, who moves from Speyer to Regensburg, from the Rhineland eastward in Germany in 1195, there are those who suggest that he did that because, there are all kinds of reasons mentioned, but there are those who suggest because his Talmidim, those who were closest with him, are starting to move east. So again, Ohr Zarua, when he comes from the east, it's not quite yet what it became. Look, Rabbeinu Tam has, Rihalovan coming from perhaps White Russia. He's got all kinds of Talmidim coming from Regensburg, Bohemia. So there were Talmidim there, but they're all coming west. By the time the Ohr Zarua goes back east, there's already a tzibur. And I'll say, there's a very interesting truth. It's Rosh Chodesh, so we can say in Yonah Diyoma. At one point, he just says, Agavorcha, that in his Kehillah, Ruvain Davin Shacharis, Shimon Lanes, and Levi Davins Musaf. His point being that their Bekiyim, apparently, first of all, it means certainly for the Torah, they can read well, that you can't do Oisavenik. But, it seems that there are Balabatim there who already are, certainly literate and, perhaps on the way to being learned. So we get an interesting glimpse, already in his day. On the other hand, one of his chuvas, he's got some chuvas, of course. He wouldn't be a German Balatos without some chuvas thrown in. One of his chuvas, he presents a chuva between Rebbe Eliezer of Bohemia. Again, I don't mean the sticks, but further east. To Rebbe Yehuda Chassid, the shaila is, can we pay our clay kodesh? In Ashkenaz, they didn't take money for positions, so to speak, in central Ashkenaz and in Western Germany. But he's saying over here in this area in the east, we can't get good clay kodesh unless we pay them. So Rabbi Yehuda Chassid basically says, if you must, Eis Lasos, go ahead. But so the Ohr Zarua is an interesting transition period where the East will become more choshev, partly because he's back there. So that's the story of his movement. Yes? Good. Now let me give you an example of how this comes all together. So for example, first of all, as I mentioned before, Ohr Zarua preserves material both from Germany and from northern France that nobody else has, from both places. For example, he quotes several times a Sefer by Rabbi Ephraim of Regensburg, the great German student of Rabbeinu Tam, a great Gadol, right? Sefer Arba Panim, a humongous Sefer Halacha of which we have a few references. So only, he's one of the few to refer to it. Sort of more, how shall I say it, more available in one of his psakim, and I'll talk about the structure of the Sefer, but one of his psakim to Seder and Ezekiel, he's got Piskei Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra, and so on, Sanhedrin. He mentions a case about misdating a star. I have the date right, but the day wrong. It's Yom, so-and-so, right? the day is right, the date is wrong. Is that just a star? I mean, if we have a ksuba like that, people pull their hair out. But is that star completely invalid, or can it be, reckoned? And he quotes there a roster of chachamim as follows. He quotes the Torah from Riva of Speyer, who died in 1133, one of the first Balei Tosfos, as presented by his Talmidim in Germany, the Rivam of Regensburg of Bohemia, Rav Yitzchak of Mordechai, Reb Moshe ben Yoel of Regensburg. So he's got all these German positions, but they're Talmidim Rabbeinu Tam. So he throws Rabbeinu Tam in there too, and he cooks up a 2-page stew, a lumdische raid here, using all of these different areas. Most of these materials that he quotes, we have nowhere else. We certainly don't have them as fully. And, that's the Mila, which is the Chisaron as follows. The Mila is he's a terrific recorder, and being a Gadol, it's all wonderful. It's a long Sefer. There's a lot of material. You have to wade through a lot of material to get to the punchline, right? So that's some of the way that he gets involved with these kinds of things. Again, just to give you some hits, hits in the sense of learning hits, lamdisha hits. From his Rebbe Reb Simcha Mishpira, the Ohr Zarua tells us a halacha on Hageh that all Balei Tshuva should go to the mikveh. Now, originally, Reb Simcha Mishpira may have said that about those who went away from Judaism, who came back, their Balei Tshuva, he sends them to the mikveh mishum kapora. It becomes adopted, though, in Hilchas Rosh Hashanah, Hilchas Yom Noroyim. All Balei Tshuva, all the men go to the mikveh. That comes from Simcha Mishpira, we don't have it in his words, but it's as recorded in the Sefer Ohr Zarua. Without the Ohr Zarua, we would not know as much about this. Reb Moshe Taku, the author of a very interesting and unusual Sefer called Ktav Tamim. Moshe Taku, not some kind of work on divine form, and is it literal or not literal, and so on. It was Reb Moshe Taku, very unusual. He was a Gadol Batorah. He was the Rav of Regensburg. He wrote Tosfos to Nidarim in Regensburg that got lost. The Ohr Zarua quotes him as a major Baal Halacha, and he has a whole discussion about Cherem HaYishuv. How do you allow people in and out of towns? Again, without the Ohr Zarua, we wouldn't know anything about it. Moving to a sort of a different genre, the Ohr Zarua is the one who quotes. He doesn't say it himself. He quotes a Ephraim of Bonn. Ephraim of Bonn learned with the German Balei Tosfos is a big baki in Piyut and in Hilchos Tefillah. Ephraim of Bonn tells the story about the Sanatokef, not in every detail, and that's not the only story version that we have. But the Ohr Zarua says, and I saw this story about Nisana Tokef and Rabbi Amnon and a little bit of, again, we've discussed this a little bit. There's a lot more to say, but he says, Miktav Yodo Shel Rabbi Ephraim of Bonn. He says, I saw it in his handwriting. Again, nowhere else do we have that kind of a validation. He quotes at one point Rabbi Ephraim of Regensburg, who had a chalom about the kashrus of a fish. Again, we have one other version of this, the so-called barbuta. Is it a sturgeon? Is it a something? It's something where the scales fall off, or the scales, something happens with the scales. In northern France, Rabbeinu Tam and Rashbam ate it, and apparently Rashi did too. Not a sturgeon. Nobody run out there. No, not Paskin and Shilas here. But some kind of a fish is barbuta, and he records there, I think in the name of Rabbi Chosid, that Rabbi Ephraim of Regensburg, who was a student of Rabbeinu Tam, said one day, listen, if it's good enough for the Rebbe, it's good enough for me. He said, let's eat the fish. Good. He has a dream that night in which he has a Gilu Eliyahu, the beautiful Hadras Ponim appears to him, a tzaddik with a long white beard and a long flowing, he looks beautiful. And in the dream, he gives him a plate of shrutzim, and he basically says to him, Es mein Kind. And by the way, this is a talky dream. This is not just something he thought of. He's having a shmuas with Eliyahu. And he says, eat this stuff. And Ephraim of Regensburg in the dream says, wait a minute, that's a treif. I can't eat this. I wouldn't touch this stuff. Basically, the figure says, well, that's about as kosher as what you allowed today. So Ephraim of Regensburg wakes up, and he said, according to one version, he breaks the plates, but he says, whoever doesn't eat this fish, tov will love bracha. Again, story in the Ohr Zarua. Now, that also leads to the Ohr Zarua. We'll talk about this in a moment, I'm sure, but he's waiting for this. the Ohr Zarua will have certain chumras where he, in effect, will say, Kol HaMachmer Tovo Abrachim. We'll talk about why this. But again, some of that is simply German Bale HaTosfos, especially those who have some connection to Chasidei Ashkenaz. So we get tight halacha, we get these stories. It's a gold mine here. If you let me, I'll go over to one more, to some of his French collection here, if you will. Again, we have Rabbeinu Tam and material that Ohr Zarua preserved that he got from his Rebbe, Rabbi Yehuda Leon. He's sitting in Paris. They've got all the Torah of Rabbeinu Tam and They're the successors, right? And he's copying it all down. He's referencing it as, only 24 hours in the day, but how he managed to do this. What I want to highlight is we have material from Reb Shimshon Mishantz. Shimshon Mishantz was the Riz star Talmud. He's responsible for the Tosfos Shantz. He was, again, a great putter together of Tosfos, but of Tosfos. The Ohr Zarua has all kinds of stuff from Rosh Mishantz that we know from nowhere else, and something else. Again, we always want to say what's important for Lomdei Torah. There's a Tosfos in Erevin Daf Ayin Beis. Tosfos there talks about rooms in a house, what needs a mezuzah, and not just what needs a mezuzah, more than that, really deeper than that. If you have boarders living in your house, can they rely on your Eruv? They have to make their right. In other words, what happens in a hotel, what happens in an apartment building, right? So basically, Tosfos there goes through and talks about, yes, there are Bochrim living there, there are Malamdim living there are others living there. Anyway, it's clear from Tosfos, but clearly we don't have the whole story. If you open up the Ohr Zarua on this issue in Hilchos Shabbos, he gives you the entire Rosh Mishantz Tosfos, milah b'milah bimlo'ah. So now you'll say, well, how do I access this? The answer is you have to, the Ohr Zarua, that's the problem. You have to kind of flip through and see where you are, but you'll be rewarded because this Tosfos, this piece that he does in much fuller detail, you wouldn't find it really anywhere else. Similarly, past the Yonah D'Yoma, lighting Neiros Shabbos, Neiros Chanukah Erev Shabbos, before Shabbos Licht, after Shabbos Licht. So most hold like the Bahag, you must light the Shabbos Licht first. Again, question of men, women, who's Makabel Shabbos where. There was a Shita, the Tur mentions B'Shem Tosfos, that there's a Shita which holds, especially if men are lighting it, they're not Makabel Shabbos with Loka, so they can light the Chanukah Licht afterwards, right? It's a Gemara about what they would do after Shabbos Licht. There was still little malachas they could do. Again, the men, not the women, not passing halachas here. The Prisha there says, the Drisha says, I'm sorry, saying, but Yagati Matsasi Yagati velo Matsasi betosfos didon. I looked through all the tosfos. I know what the Tur is talking about. Avu is them tasfos. He doesn't know, right? He suspects that there must be some other tosfos because he's the Prisha Drisha. But if you look in the Ohr Zarua, he's got a langa arichas on this in the name of the Rosh Mishantz. It's clear that this was a Tosfos Shantz that we don't necessarily have, but the Ohr Zarua preserves it. And if you understand that the Tur's father, the Rosh, based his Tosfos HaRosh on Tosfos Shantz, it's very obvious that we're dealing here with a ket on Tosfos Shantz, which the Ohr Zarua has. So he fills in all these gaps in a remarkable way. There's a Maisa that he quotes from the Rosh Mishantz. He says, in our Shchuna, right, by Shchuna Shalanu, there was Epis HaGoyish Kind. I don't know, it's a foundling, a 1-year-old child. And Epis, he needed, I don't know exactly why, there were no parents. Somehow, I don't know if it's an adoption, it's not clear, but there's mamish a case, you wouldn't believe it unless you saw it, where they want to give him a bris milah. In other words, he's going to be raised by Jews. And the problem was he was Epis a little bit gemalt, they did something. To do a milah on a 1-year-old is not the same to do on an 8-year-old baby. They go to the Moila Mumchin, they'll tell you if a kid can't have a bris sometimes because of some medical delay, to do a bris on a 6-month-old, a 1-year-old, you need a bigger Mumchin. You need certain Moilim who are experts in that. The Rosh Mishantz said we have to look around to find a Moil. Nishtazai Poshit. Again, this Maisa is not known from anywhere else. We wouldn't know where this Maisa is. So again, he's sitting on a tremendous amount of material. Is a psak of Rosh Mishantz. Rosh Mishantz says, it's all French, Mishum haramoim, because of people playing tricks, we don't accept the taina. 2 balei din are going to a din Torah. One says, I want to go to the best, and I go to, I'm holding out for Hill and Shammai, or their equivalent. So what do? We pull our hair out. We go to Etzro, we go to Lakewood. Where do we go? We don't know where to go. He says, no business. If there's a sufficient lamdin in your town, that's where you go. No more of this business. That's a gewaldige psak from the Rosh Mishans, only recorded in the Ohr Zarua. I'll give you two more such examples. Then you could ask more questions. I have more things to say anyway. You have to direct me here. He quotes on the general history side, if you will. We know that in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, not the lateral, but the Lateran, a church council, among their other gzeiros, said that Jews have to wear a yellow badge. No, they wear some sign. So we know that it wasn't really enforced that strictly. It ran its course because they keep saying later, "Oh, do it again." Means they weren't really the general population was not makbid. It's the question of when the government makes rules, do you follow them or not? Anyway, they were not following it, but the Rosh Mishans in Hilchos Shabbos says, and he got to France somewhere around after 1215, 1217, 1218, basically. They're talking in Hilchos Shabbos. He said, we were clearing, how do we attach this ofan? He doesn't say why. We have to put a siman on our begodim, and we have to go on the street with it. So we have to not just clip it on, it's like the Shabbos keys. We have to sew it on. What's a sufficient sewing that we shouldn't be over Hilchos Shabbos? Meaning, I once told this to a great general historian. I said, I have evidence for you that at least some Jews were aware of it. He says, where? I tell him this halachic work. He thinks I'm out of my mind. I said, they're declaring how to put this sign on their begodim kifi halacha. Meaning, so even though it wasn't a terrible gzeira, it fell by the wayside, he's sitting there right at that time, and he's telling us this agavorcha. He's telling us this is part of Hilchos Shabbos. And finally, on this round, he quotes from his Rebbe, the Sar Mikutzi, right? He's called Reb Shimshon Mikutzi, one of the Re's absolute youngest Talmidim. He calls him the Sar because the Rosh is the Rosh Mishan. So we unscramble it. The Sar Mikutzi, he learned, he heard the Masorah that Rabbeinu Gershom had a son who may have been shmated and so on, and Rabbeinu Gershom paskin, he has to sit shiva 14 days from Miriam. It's a gewaldige tzara. Again, that Masorah, and there's discussion about it. There's earlier discussion, there's later discussion, but that Masorah is sitting there right in the Ohr Zarua. So bottom line, halachos we don't know from elsewhere, Tosas pieces we don't know from elsewhere, not just Maisalach, but real important Ma'aser Rav and Ma'aser Shahayu from Germany, from France. He's got it all. So that's what makes the Ohr Zarua, to my mind, such an important sefer. Again, the problem is you have to read through. You have to really start to, train yourself. If I'm learning Maseches Brachas, so his Hilchos Brachas, even though it doesn't go exactly in the order, his Hilchos Brachas will parallel. Same Shabbos, same Erevim, same Moadim, and we'll talk about the structure of the Sefer now and some of his own chiddushim in a second, but ask me what you want to ask me at this point. Ad kan hakafa aleph, or I don't know, maybe hakafa beis.
Yeah, I think that's really the next question is really the structure of the Sefer, and we'll get to the publication history.
Yes, I'm getting there.
Okay, I'll let you wait till when it was published. But I will say, talk about the first. Let's talk about the structure of the Sefer, right, how it's organized, and also, I mean, you mentioned this in brief. I think you keep mentioning this. So I think, how does it differ from the Mordechai? It's the last episode we talked about the Mordechai being
very good. Okay. So let's review the Mordechai, and then we'll get into this. We don't ask questions, but if the audience wants to volunteer, they remember the answer. That's good. I have to tell you, one of my doctorantim, I was saying something in class, and so I asked a question, and somebody gave a good answer, and I said, how do you know that? And he said, I heard it on your Mordechai podcast. So even the young professional doctorantim are learning from the podcast. So this is not only for the devoted people who are listening from your audience. Apparently, even my students are listening. So I have to make sure I'm giving good information. Now, for many reasons. The Mordechai, of course, goes Lefi HaMasechtos, which is one of its valuable points, right? Yeah, I'm giving Shiurim now in Bava Basra. I'm sitting with the Mordechai, and I'm bringing out for the Shir all kinds of interesting things that you're not going to find in the Tos on the spot and so on and so forth, and maybe not even in the Shita Mikubetz. So on the one hand, it's very easy to use the Mordechai. On the other hand, we discussed last time, it's humongous is not the word. It's beyond humongous. In other words, every Masechta is an Otzar Balul. The Ohr Zarua is trying to, he's earlier, and again, he's arguably got, quote unquote, somewhat less material, but nonetheless. The Ohr Zarua basically organizes his own organization for Shulchan Aruch. It's the same kind of an idea, just in different ways. And again, the point is that even though he's got French connections in a positive sense and German connections, this is a German Sefer. It's a big discursive Sefer. He writes a lot, and he goes from topic to topic, but he organized it topically. Now, what I was thinking, how can I characterize it? I would say like this: if we define Orach Chaim, in Torah and Shulchan Aruch, what is Orach Chaim? Things that must happen on some day of the year, things that happen every day, things that happen only on Shabbos, things that happen only on Purim. But basically, Orach Chaim is Isser v'Heter or Hanhagos, mitzvos that must come up during the year, right? What's Yoredeya? The rest of the Isurim and mitzvos that can come up during the year. If you don't eat meat, you don't need shechita. But if you do, hopefully you won't be an oval at a certain period. Not everybody's a malva beribis. Not everybody has a yayin nesach shaila, right? Not everybody has a hilchos nida shaila. So I married, so on and so forth. Okay. The Ohr Zarua does something like that, only a little differently. Basically, the Ohr Zarua, as he constructed it, has 4 halakim as we have it. It's 3, 4, but let's stick with that kind of sort of 3 halakim model. And when we get to the published editions, you'll see exactly where this goes. The first chelek is what I would call halachos that could happen any day of the year. So how do those start out? So you start Hilchas Tzedakah, which, by the way, is again part of his, what do I front load in my Sefer, right? Hilchas Tzedakah and Shulchan Aruch is in your Yoredeya, because maybe you have no money by you, maybe you have no money. You don't know. Could I give Tzedakah every day except Shabbos? Yes. Hilchas Tzedakah, Hilchos Brachos, Hilchos Tefillah, Hilchos Shchita, right? And as he goes into other topics. Hilchos Nida is in the first chelek. This is not the exact order. Hilchos Gittin and Agunos is in the first chelek. Why? Because these are things that could come up any day at any time. So it's basically what we call sort of, I don't want to call it common halachas that could happen every day, but it really, as he's got Evan Ha'ezer stuff, he's got chiddushim too, because these are things that you, again, except for Shabbos, these are things you could have to worry about any day of the week, theoretically, maybe not Chol Hamoed, whatever it is, most days of the year. The next chelek is the chelek of Moadim, right? Those are days that only can come up at certain times. Now, he happens to put Beis HaKnesses and Kriyas HaTorah into Shabbos and Moadim, but that's not so silly. That makes a lot of good sense. Then he also puts Avelus in that section, probably again, Moed of a different type. So that's his basic order. Again, I didn't do all the topics that I gave you in the exact order he gives them, but that's the base. But he does the topics a lot, Kefi Seder HaMasechtos, at least in a broad way, usually. So at least you have some sense. Hilchos Shabbos, a little bit of Kefi Seder HaMasechta, but again, you can see, especially with the additions that we have, you can see where he's going. So you can start to look. And by the way, there are maftechas too, and the maftechas are pretty detailed. What that leaves is the last chelik, which I call Hilchos Nezikin. Those are the pisk, and those he goes l'fiyah masechta. Those are also gigantic masechtas, right? Hilchos Bava Kama, Hilchos Bava Mitzia, Piskei, I should say. Piskei Bava Kama, Piskei Bava Mitzia, Piskei Bava Basra, Piskei Avodah Zarah, Piskei Sanhedrin, Piskei Shavuos, Damarnu. So again, it's meant to be utilitarian. However, it is very hard to control it. And so, for example, one of his own chiddushim, which is picked up by the Ramo and Yoredeya, has to do with making a bracha after shechita. What happens if I shech the behema and I forgot to make the bracha, and now the behema is geshachted? So the Rambam says, over lasiyasan, over shechitaso, bottle of brikaso, right? I just made that up, right? No bracha, sorry, HaKadosh Baruch Hu forgive you, but sorry. And the Ramo and Yoredeya Siman Yud Tes says, nope, not 8 hours later, but if the Geshachte the Behem is bleibda, you can make al hashchit. It becomes a kind of birkas hashavach. Now, the truth is, the Ohr Zarua, as far as I can tell, gets it from his Rebbe, the Ravia, but that's okay. The Ravia was a gewaldige mechadesh in Hilchos Brachos. I'll write about that another time. I have it planned. But in any case, things that are unbelievable. In any case, so that's the Ohr Zarua in the middle of Hilchos Shchita, and that's the problem. He has a section on Hilchos Brachas. The Ohr Zarua, for example, holds like the Ravid against the Rambam. Again, the Ravid is over Lasiyosan, Birkas Kedushin before. Birkas, everything's before. The only thing not before is a ger coming out of the mikveh. Okay. The Ravid says, for example, no, and we do different things, right? Hilchas Erusin must be after because, and Hilchas, the bracha and Mila, some of the bracha must be after. Why? Basically, if it's your body doing the Maisa Mitzvah, so it's not, kind of a bracha shebaguf, you can make it before, over Lasi Yosem. But the moment you have another habeas corpus, another body involved, right? I don't want to make a joke, but the Kala could come to the chuppah and say, excuse me, I want to rethink this. So he made the Birkas Kedusha before, and she's thinking about it again. If she decides 5 days later it's okay, he's still in trouble. So we wait till she accepts the Kedushin, then we make it. Same thing with Mila. The baby's involved. The Moel, it's not Bidei HaMoel. It's not like he's putting tefillin on his arm. Anyway, that's the Ravid Shita. The Ohr Zarua holds the same way in 4 different places. In other words, you have to look in all kinds of Hilchos, Brachos contexts to put it all together. So that's one of the chesronos that you sometimes have to put pieces together. You don't get the full picture till you look at all the different pieces. And he doesn't always tell you that. So again, that's the discursiveness. So in that sense, less easy to use than the Mordechai, which goes daf by daf literally. But on the other hand, it's a lot shorter of a sefer. I mean, you have to, again, you have to get used to it. You have to wade in and, start with sugyas. I would say if you're learning, anybody's learning in the Zikin, take a look. You'll see things you wouldn't see anywhere else. If you're learning in Yonah Yorachaim, take a look. You'll find it close enough. So that's the basic structure, and that's the comparison to the Sefer Mordechai. By the way, again, it's now Rosh Chodesh Ador. Pesach is around the corner, right? Rashi says, "B'shnichnas adamar b'simcha." What's the Rashi on Tainus? Nisim she'iru Yisrael yemei Purim u Pesach. We're not just happy for Purim; we're holding by Pesach Shoin. The Ohr Zarua has an unbelievable source. He's got the Perush of Reb Shmuel Mifalez. Reb Shmuel Mifalez, great Baal HaTosah, Reb Shmuel Mifalez, a very important French Baal HaTosah in the first part of the 13th century. Very involved in Tosaf Ohr Zarua, who gives us a Givaldige Perush Hilchati to the piyut. I think it's Simon Rachel involved in Chelik Beis, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, Ranu, it's not by accident, to a piyut of Rabbi Yosef Tovelim. Rabbi Yosef Tovelim wrote a piyut, a yotzer for Parshas, Shabbos HaGodel, where he goes in poetic fashion. He goes through the Ganze Hilchos Pesach. Except you need a real lamdan to tell you what Shittas he holds. And Rabbi Shmuel Faz go line by line, everything from B'dikas Chometz to kashering to the entire Seder. He goes through halacha by halacha, and he gives you what the Shittas are, how he holds. The Ohr Zarua incorporates this entire thing into his Sefer. It's not the Ohr Zarua, it's Rav Shmuel Falez, but he's a quoter. There are a few places where what Shmuel Falez says actually disagrees with something that the Ohr Zarua says doesn't bother him. Somebody wants to learn the Inyonei Pesach well in the Rishonim, treat yourselves to Reb Shmuel Mifalez. By the way, Rav Zinner, the Nute Gavriel, the Gvaldige Posek Rav Zinner, published a separate volume where he has this Perush from other Kisveyad. You could knock yourself out. You could learn a Ganze Hilchos Pesach very, very well from the Rishonim. But it's the Ohr Zarua who brought this to the public. And what's also amazing is, I don't think Reb Shmuel Falez was more than 10 years older or so, or 50, than the Ohr Zarua. He's got that in there. He somehow was able to put it into a sefer. I don't know how he did this, but he was able to do it. So this is, again, these are some of the, what I'll call the advantages, right? He actually quotes the Smag once, the Ohr Zarua I found. The Smag is an exact contemporary, but I think maybe they were both in the base marriage together, sitting by Rabbi Yehuda Silion. Maybe what the Smag said when he was a young Eloi. So he's got it down. I remember in yeshiva days. I'm not sure. He doesn't. Who I know Megalev is Rav Moshe Mikutzi, and it's not somebody else. It's his words. So he was awake 27 hours a day, putting in all these things. I will talk about his Hilchas Nida HaChokas in a second. Let me first, we can't do without that. But by the way, you heard me already. Never mind the Chumra Hilchas Nida, which I'll get to. How about the Kula and Hilchas Brachas? In other words, you have to take him the Kulas with the Chumras, but we'll talk about that in a very serious way in a second. Just about the additions. So the Ohr Zarua, again, in Yonah D'Yomel at Tzarenu Harav, the first parts of the Ohr Zarua, parts 1 and 2, the way he put it together, the way it was put together, published in Zhitomir. That's in Ukraine in 1862. For a long time, it was not available. Dachzichmir, I was not able to check this, but Dachzichmir, both the Aruch HaShulchan and the Mishnah Brur and Hilchas Shabbos say, Oh, Zachinu, ich hab gefunden the Ohr Zarua. I mean, they're writing. The Mishnah Berurah dies in 1933. The Ohr Zarua dies in 1918. 1862. It's not been out for hundreds of years. We got a hold of the Ohr Zarua and Hilchos Shabbos. Givaldik. We solved some problems here, right? So it's a relatively late sefer. Luckily, we have it. The Trumas Hadeshen, who lived in the 15th century, has lots of Ohr Zarua. He still had lots of pieces. And I talked about this once before, I think, in passing. When the Shach wants to find an Ohr Zarua, what does he do? He's before 1862. He dials up the Trumas Hadeshen, and so does the Ketzos. So they know the Ohr Zarua too, derech somebody like the Trumas Hadeshen. But most of you can get it in Jitamir. Also, by the way, the Ohr Zarua is the second most popular. It's 1A and 1B. Citation in the Hagos Ashri. The Hagos Ashri cites the Maharich, Reb Chizki of Magdeburg, who sat with the Ohr Zarua on a Bezdin together. He was younger. The Ohr Zarua had a problem with him when he was young. He was a chazan. They didn't want to rehire him. His father was a chazan. Ohr Zarua got involved. But anyway, they sit together in the Hagos Ashri. You'll see lots of Ohr Zaruas. You'll see lots of Maharichs. So there are references, but we really don't get the addition until then. Zachinu b'shanim ha'achronot, we've really been zochem. 2 different editions of the Ohr Zarua have been published in recent years. The one that's easier to use, and I would recommend, since it's the only one that has the entire Ohr Zarua that we have so far, is the one that I'm not a paid spokesman. The one that I have here sitting in my house, Machon Yerushalayim, in I think 2010 Leminyonim, a very nice edition. It clarifies the text. By the way, the Mordechai we talked about, terrible kisveyad problems, terrible print problems, till came along Machon Yerushalayim. The Ohr Zarua wasn't as bad l'chatchila, but again, Machon Yerushalayim makes it gleich. They separate the simonim well. They do refer to kisveyad. I'll talk about the kisveyad in a second. They've got very nice footnotes, and it's shimushi, as they say in Israel. It's very user-friendly, and it's, it doesn't fool around. It goes piece by piece by piece. The ha'aras are not miles long. They're la'inyan, and so on and so forth. There is also, the Ohr Zarua was started by a Hesder yeshiva called Ohr Etzion, not Har Etzion, Ohr Etzion. And the Ohr Etzion Chevra did an exceptionally thorough job. Daiget sich with the kisveyad, daiget sich with all the possible marmakomos. The problem was it took them a yovel and a mitvach to put out pieces because they were giving it ad hasof. A little bit like the Machon Yerushalayim. The first volumes of the Mordechai, they went ad hasof, took them years, and they ended up with a handful. Ohr Etzion is still going. I think about 4 or 5 krachim have come out. We have it in our YU library. I was there in Israel the other week. They have it in the National Library of Israel. You can't find it everywhere. It's worth looking at. If you ever have a problem in Ohr Zarua and they publish that section, go right there. They work the kisveyad issues out completely. There are some great ha'aras there in terms of what the Ohr Zarua meant and so on. But between these 2 editions, we have no problem. The problem with the kisveyad, interestingly, is the Mordechai. The problem is there are too many kisveyad. Which ones do you use? The Ohr Zarua, there are too few. There are about 2.5 kisveyad, maybe 3.5, depending on how you count. The problem is that there are some parts of the Ohr Zarua where we only have 1 ketav yad. That's not good. In other words, we'd love to have chafifa so you can compare. We don't have that. That makes it more challenging. Although I have to say that Professor Tashma Alav Hashalom many years ago found pieces of the Ohr Zarua's chuvas and other things in what he calls ketav yad Cincinnati. They say Ketav Yad Cincinnati, not the Cincinnati Reds, right? But Cincinnati in Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. They had Kisveyad, Jewish Kisveyad. They had sitting there, Cincinnati 154, pieces of Ohr Zarua. So we can hope, who knows where the next piece is and what derful it is, but maybe there are other pieces that we'll yet have. But at this point, these are the best editions that we have. And the Machon Yerushalayim is very shimi. They publish it in 3, not gigantic volumes, a little bit like the Mordechai. They're weighty, but you can carry all 3 at the same time.
Yeah. I'm going to jump in. Yes, the Machon Yerushalayim, it's read in 3 volumes. I don't want to say prices so much because inflation and everything, but it's around $100, 3 volumes. The Ohr Etzion, so interestingly, one of the volumes that they have it here, Moadim Zroim, has Machon Yerushalayim's logo as well. They did it in conjunction or something.
No, they started together, but they agreed to disagree because it'll take them, 100 years, not 100, but it'll take them, right.
So there's a few volumes of the Ohr Zarua.
Right.
Like you said, they're hard to get. But the footnotes and things is much more extensive if you
Right.
want. So those you can. But the Machon Shlaim is widely available.
Right.
And then also, I still think they may even sell that old 3-volume, the old print. The original.
Well, it's the old one. Yeah, the Jita, which by the way is usable. It's as I say. I don't mean this personally, but it's better than some of the Mordechais that are in the back of the Shas. It's readable. It's usable. They've done a new photo offset. It's a smaller size. That's basically Arba Shem Shtayim. It's 4 parts of the Ohr Zarua in 2 volumes. So, yeah, I walked into a Sefer store here in Teaneck, a new Sefer store. In fact, I think it's got a Lakewood connection, but that's whatever, a couple of years ago. And I walked in and I saw on the shelf the 3-volume Ohr Zarua, and I bought it. I said immediately, this is a wonderful Sefer store. They said, well, how do you know? I said, because if you have that Ohr Zarua there and the price was less than 100, I said, it's going to have Hatzlacha. Anyway, so if you see a 3-volume Ohr Zarua, right, unless the price has been inflated severely beyond what you suggest, it's a wonderful Purim present or Pesach present or Bar Mitzvah present or whatever present you think.
Yeah, actually, I think it used to be less than 100. Could be you still could come across. I'm just throwing out like a rough estimate around there. Now,
right.
What about so I want to ask you 2 questions about the publication, though. So, I mean, do you know what was the story that it was published in Shetomer in 1862? I mean, they were usually there was Hasidic farm, not necessarily Rishonim. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
From what I can tell, the answer is simply Zhitomir was a very big Jewish press at that time. Zhitomir was cranking out material. So again, even if you're mostly publishing Hasidic material, Mikau or Zarua, as I say, the Achronim know who he is. In other words, it's A1 quality here. So I suspect that's what happened. It's either that or some Yodei Sefer had connections to Zhitomir said you should do this. But that's it's not being published in some place that never published Sfarim. They somehow fell onto an Ohr Zarua. So that's, I think, the answer.
Right. Now the second point is you mentioned this offhand, but just to emphasize, did later Rishonim and the early Achrayim, did they have it? Did they use it? Was it quoted?
So again, that's the problem. Not as much as it could have been. As I say, the Trumas Hadeshen, who's in the 15th century, quotes the Ohr Zarua a ton. And the Trumas Hadeshen, obviously very important. The Ramah quotes the Ohr Zarua. I gave you one example. I'll give you a couple more. He quotes, I think, about 10 or 15 times, not a million times, but he quotes it with some frequency. Again, the Shach knows the Ohr Zarua. The Bach knows the Ohr Zarua. Again, at least they know Shitos. The Ksos knows the Ohr Zarua. If you look. But the point that you're making, we've talked about this before. Those Sfarim, it's like the Ravia. Who quotes the Ravia before it's published in the 20th century, late 19th, early into the 20th century? Not as many as could. The Ohr Zarua, again, is a little better because it had been cited by earlier authorities very frequently. But the answer is it's not as involved as it could have been. The difference, does that raise the question that we discussed in a prior podcast, I think, right? When you find quote-unquote new Svarim, what's their weight? Except, again, I think the Ohr Zarua, as I say, from that Mishnah Berurah and that Aruch HaShulchan, they thought the Ohr Zarua was Kazeh Bar Samcha Bein HaRishonim. They bought him hook, line, and sinker. In other words, the fact that he was missing for a while, they considered him, absent with an excuse, absent with a teretz. It wasn't his fault. But bottom line, he's not quoted every day. Again, I'll make the same distinction I meant when we talked about it then. For learning, you can't move it out. As far as I'm concerned, you shouldn't move without looking at the Ohr Zarua if you can. For halacha, the poskim may have different views. By the way, I'll throw out another juicy tidbit, which I won't talk about now. If the Minchas Chinuch had the Ohr Zarua, boy, could he have solved a lot of his chakiras. Oh, boy. It's great minds thinking alike. I have notes on this, but in any case, it's it's remarkable. In other words, the Ohr Zarua, because he's got so many different shittas in there, you can clear across a series of things and come up with. At one point I was giving him the Chiddushim, and I said, we got to get the Minchas Chinuch of the Ohr Zarua. But anyway, he didn't have it. Kani Resha Lo Hayalo. So that's the problem. Yeah.
Okay, so now I think we should go back to the thing, one of the maybe the most famous Ohr Zarua, the one that was quoted, the one that everybody knows, and was Yamachber. But let's talk about the Ohr Zarua.
Right. So, and again, we're not asking halachas here and shilas here at all. We're just commenting on it. So, Ona Hasmucha LaOna, right? In other words, the separation as the prior month's date for the nida is coming up for the married couple, right? So the Ohr Zarua has a chumrah to separate earlier on the following month. Okay, and the question where he gets it from, and for example, and by the way, he says it's a chumrah, and he basically says, tavo ala machmir bracha, more or less, which the Bach picks up. Again, the Bach knows it. The Shach Kedarko tries to prove it in the Gemara. Because again, the question is, where is he getting it from? So Lule de Mistafina, I believe the Ohr Zarua is getting this, because he has other examples, which I'll give you in a second, from a mocker called Brisa de Maseches Nida. Brisa de Maseches Nida is a very unusual source. It's associated with the Hechalos. It's a treatment of Hilchas Nida, which treats Hilchas Nida both in terms of Isser v'Heter and in terms of Tumah v'Tara, right? So in other words, if you take, for example, in Hilchas Nida, the Maharsha is like this. We observe Hilchas Nida, Yeridea, Isser v'Heter, right? We don't really consider the Tumah v'Tara issues. We go according to the lines of Isser v'Heter. But the truth is that there are issues of Tumah v'Tara as well, where there might be certain chumras, right? Maharsha makes his point in terms of what the chazak is and so on and so forth. This Brisa de Maseches Nida says, or argues as an overall principle, that the Tumah v'Tahara aspect is critical, and I'll put it as positively as I can because it's meant to be positive. The same way that we make harchokis in Hilchas Shabbos, the Rabbonans, to stay away from malacha, and the same way that we make abizrayu d'avodah zarah, sometimes very extensively, they don't argue with this formally, to stay away from, God forbid, in Yonei avodah zarah. Kach, we make tremendous harchakos, which the Gemara has many of them, but we make more, right? Siag l'Torah, to avoid the problem, God forbid, inadvertently of nida, right? Because there is sakana involved, there's tuma involved, there's sakana involved, not boogeymen, but this is a halacha. And by the way, I'll say it, chamira sakante meisura. And that Brisa de Maseches Nida has that happening in a number of places. The Ohr Zarua himself in one place, it's in Chelek Aleph Siman Shin Samach, you could look it up, says, where he's talking about harchakas, about handing things husband to wife and so on. He's going through many examples, and about sleeping arrangements and chahena v'chadome. He says that kol masha odom or masha nucha lahachmir benida yachmir. The more the merrier the chumras. Right? And later in that same Siman says, the problem here with Ani Shamati Mitam Sakana. Now, he's trying to protect his readers. And that, I think, is what's underlying the ona smucha ona. In other words, and that's why. So the Shach, Kedarko Bakodesh, wants to make it a Gemara. The Bach says, it's a chumrah, but what kind of chumrah is it? It's a chumrah based on this kind of Brisa de Maseches Nida, based on the spiritual sakana issue that's related to Inyane Nida, and I think that's where he's getting it from. By the way, the Ohr Zarua talks about at some length, quoting other shittas. There's only one sheet that's really makel. Women not, so to speak, looking at a Sefer Torah b'mini dusan, certainly not holding. Min hadin in Yeridei, I'm not paskin shilas. Could a woman touch a Sefer Torah? Medina the Yeridei, l'chori yes. Again, chaber ramah, but there might be room to that. But once you put in the Hilchas Nida aspect, forget it. Coming into shuls, that's why the Ramah has to say in our Chai, right? For Yomim No Roy and for other important names, let the women in. Lazim Ibri, if they're B'Yemei Buna, we can't. It's not nice. The women are going crazy. They want to come to shul to daven. The Ohr Zarua this is one of his inyanim, and I think. Now, by the way, just to show you, not all Rishonei Ashkenaz agree, and I actually have some of this. I don't want to sell my books, but in my peering through the Lattice's book, I have a lengthy discussion of all of this toward the end of chapter 2, for those who have it. The Ra'avon, Reb Eliezer Reb Nosson, the leading German Baal HaTosfos at the time of Rabbeinu Tam, earlier than the Ohr Zarua, he cuts down the reliance on Brisa de Maseches Nida. He says, let's go, stricter halacha. Let's not have some of these chumras, which again, poskim can do that, gedolim can do that. But that seems to be the source of this, or a source. So again, as I said earlier on in the talk, right, how much Chassidut Ashkenaz or that kind of thing gets integrated in the halacha? Does it get integrated as halacha? Does it get integrated as prishut v'Chassidut? Right? but the Ohr Zarua has this. This is the most famous example and the most known example, but it happens in other places. By the way, the Sefer Okeach has this too. Of course, Rav Okeach has something about this, and people should take a look just to get the Inyan. If you look at the Ramban on in Bereshis, where Rachel says to her father, "Derech Nashimli," the Ramban talks about the sakana. Again, not God forbid boogeyman. No, we should get nervous. But in other words, the sakana ruchanis that can be generated by inyone nida and daila hakim beremiza. Again, chamira sakanta misur. The Ramban, by the way, also was very partial to the Bryce and Maseches Nida. Again, as a makubal, but nonetheless. So that's, I think, a lot of what's happening here, in my humble opinion. And again, we'll see if we hear from our friends whether people agree or disagree. In any case, and by the way, on the other hand, again, just like we had the kula about brachas, about the bracha after the shechita, on the other hand, there are more quotes at the very end of Hilchos Yom HaKippur, the last simon, right before building the sukkah. I think it's Tafresh Chav Dalet. There are more quotes from the Ohr Zarua, Machlokes Rishonim. Don't get nervous. Whether you German Rishonim, German Chachamim, whether you fast 2 days Yom Kippur, Sveika the Yom. Don't get nervous; it'll be fine. Rabbi Yehuda, and the Ohr Zarua says, my Rebbe Rabbi Yehuda Chosid fasted 2 days. My Rebbe Reb Simcha Mishpira fasted only 1 day, and I'm learning from him 1 day Mishum Hasakona. It's dangerous to fast 2 days. That's you have to be Superman. So again, my point being here too, he's very sensitive to sakana and halacha, hein lechumra, hein lekula. So my point is, we should not take this one psak of the Ohr Zarua out of context. If we put in all this background material, it begins, at least to a large extent, to make more sense. I think part of the problem that the Shach has, he's the Shach, so he wins in the Shach and in Nekudas HaKesef to try to explain what the Ohr Zarua Shita is al pi Gemara, and he goes on at length in the Nekudas HaKesef there, is because it may be, I don't mean beyond the Gemara, but it may be you have to add in this other material from Chazal, right? Now, not everybody treated Bryce and Masech Nida the same. The Ohr Zarua was definitely I would say a fan, but a consumer of this material. Yes, so that addresses that smoking question, at least a little bit, I hope.
And so that's the most famous Ohr Zarua. I mean, are there other very famous ones that you didn't mention?
Again, listen, the problem is that to me now, these are all famous, Baruch Hashem, but when I was writing my dissertation, one of the people reading it, I said, there's a famous something here, and the person wrote to me, he was himself a very knowledgeable person, well, it's famous to you and the other three people who are interested in it, but look, I mean, again, the Ohr Zarua, and anybody who goes to learn Smicha Yeredeya knows the Ohr Zarua and Siman Yotes. I mean, they know that Ohr Zarua. Again, where the Ramak quotes him about 20 times, these few are the most significant. Again, I mean, most people don't want to know about Yom Kippur, although it has a happy ending thanks to the Ohr Zarua. But those are among the most important Ohr Zaruas. Oh, there's a wonderful. I mean, again, famous. There's a wonderful Ohr Zarua in Hilchos Rosh Hashanah. He takes up at great length the question again of fasting on Rosh Hashanah with tshuva. Machlokas Geonim, Rishonim, and he gives us a machlokas again between internal Gedolei Ashkenaz, names we do know, names we don't know so well. And say for Ezra, Ichlu Mashmanim Shesumam Takim, have a Suda. What kind of a Suda? But have a Yom Tov Dikka sort of Rosh Hashanah Dikka Sauda. But he quotes a number of Balei HaTosfos who say no. Kindness, because interesting svara shulchan rabcha rekam, right? The karbonos for Rosh Hashanah, what is right? One for Rosh Hashanah, right? Other Yom Tov have two. Anyway, very interesting machlokas. Again, lamaisa, there's plenty of room to be makel, but he raises all kinds of issues that others don't. And he doesn't do it himself. He brings it from others. He may give an opinion, but he brings it from others. Again, the kesem of the Ohr Zarua, not kesem with a kaf, kesem with a kuf, right? The attractiveness of the Ohr muksam, in Israeli Hebrew, if it's muksam, I'm really enchanted by it, attracted by it. The kesem of the Ohr Zarua is the shittas that he brings, and that's, by the way, Urbach has about 10 pages on the Ohr Zarua. That's it in Balei HaTosfos. I mean, that's a nice chunk. He says. most important are this whole variegation of Rishonim, some of which we don't know from anywhere else. I want to bring in, by the way, the Ohr Zarua and the Rambam, which is interesting, and I want to talk about his son and the Kitzur Ohr Zarua. So all right, we'll go to those two. Yeah, are we okay on time? Are we?
Yeah, we're perfect. And I was going to ask you about his son, Marach Ohr Zarua, as he's known.
So Baruch Shekivanti, right. So let me say a word about the Rambam, which is interesting. I think I mentioned this in passing in some of the other podcasts. In my strange way of thinking, I'm thinking that somehow people see connections between them, and maybe they do, and that's helpful. But in any case, it's helpful for their own thinking and learning. So interesting, the Rambam is hardly quoted. We talked about this in Tosas and Shas, twice in the printed Tosas, very little. And we talked about it. It's not because they don't like the Rambam. It's not because of his philosophy. It's a different Gisha and Halacha. It's a code. The method of picking sugis is different. There are many reasons to explain it. We talked about it then at some length. Ayin Sham or Tishmu Sham. And one of the people who, of course, uses the Rambam is the Smag. But we talked about the Smag is in Spain. The Smag is preaching. The Smag has reasons to want to use the Rambam. All good. Amongst German Rishonim, the Ohr Zarua is really the first one to use the Rambam a tremendous amount in halacha, not just for piyut and but in halacha in Sefer Ohr Zarua. But there's an interesting pattern that hasn't been noticed properly. Namely, the Ohr Zarua quotes the Rambam about 160 times. By the way, I did that. The Or Etzion edition helped me. They have an index, right? So I have to read through the whole thing, but you can check your work. 160 times. 160 times, even a big Sefer, is a lot. Right? Tosas quotes Rambam twice. 160 is Hamon. But if you look at the citations, you'll find, for the most part, what I call onesies. One or two in Hilchas Megillah, one or two in Hilchas Pesach, one or two in Hilchas Nida. He knows the Rambam, but he's not lo mit dayanim, as they would say in Israel. He's not getting involved with him. As one of my colleagues said, he doesn't engage the Rambam so much. Okay. In 3 areas in the Ohr Zarua, there is a noticeable engagement. Number 1, in Hilchas Shabbos, where he quotes the Rambam all the time, Shabbos and Erevin. 2, Hilchos Gittin Va'agunos. Interesting, he calls it Hilchos Gittin Va'agunos. It's not so much today's Aguna problems with what they did and all that stuff. It's really people who we don't know how to, the husband disappeared, God forbid, all kinds of unbelievable things. But they didn't work better, but they had to have all these shilas. And in Piskei Bav Mitzia, from Elu B'tzias to the 5th parak, to Hazahav and Hasocher, to Ezu Neshach, right? Sort of the guts of the Hilchas Ribis and Mitzia, stuff like that, and a little bit also in Hilchas Sanhedrin, where he quotes the Rambam many, many, many times. The question is, what happened here? And it can't be he only had the Rambam's halachas here, because he quotes them in many other places too. I think the answer goes as follows. Why Hilchas Shabbos? So I'll just add the other thing that the Ohr Zarua quotes all the time in Hilchas Shabbos Ve'erin, Rashi on Shas. Now, you can't go wrong quoting Rashi on Shas, but if you're a Sefer Halacha, what are you doing with Rashi on Shas? And the answer is the Ohr Zarua looked at Hilchas Shabbos, and what did he have? He had the Sefer Yereim, a Otzer Balum, but a small Sefer, right? As the Ohr Zarua is long, that's short. You get Hilchas Shabbos, you get Malachas, you get the Rabbanans, you get something. Very, very brief. Sefer HaTruma, same kind of a thing. The Smag he doesn't have in front of him. The Ohr Zarua wants to write what I'll call a beautiful Hilchas Shabbos for Ashkenaz with all the trimmings. Who do you turn to write a full-fledged Hilchas Shabbos? You go to Mishnah Torah, there are 30 prakim. It's a beautiful structure, if I may say. He's got everything organized. And you not copy, but you use that as a Moreh Derech. And what do you use Rashi for? Because again, if you want to explain the Hilchas Shabbos, who explains Gemara is better than Rashi? So you treat it in this not blown up way, but in this expanded way that explains Hilchas Shabbos. What about Hilchas Aguna and Gittin? So there, it's not even so much how many times. In 25 Simonim, he quotes the Rambam, I think, 12 times. It's like every simon, every other simon. It's unbelievable. And sometimes he paskins like the Rambam. At one point, he paskins like the Rambam against the Rashbam. It's unbelievable. At another point, he says, I'd like to paskin like the Rambam here, and I know he wants to be mati the Aguna, but he's working too hard. He says, I'd love to, but right? So what's the answer? Hilchas Kiddushin, he doesn't quote the Rambam, because Hilchas Kiddushin, the Baal Ayatollah says no. They have the Masor Ashkenazis. They don't need any help. I don't mean it in a haughty way, God forbid. They're the Gdolim. The Ramban says, you do what you want. In Hilchas Gittin, everybody can be helpful. And they held around was a lamdan. So if this lamdan has other ways for us to get out of Gittin, or to get out Agunis, or to kasher up Gittin, or whatever it is, we'll use them. In other words, we need them. We use them because it's a need-to-know basis. V'chein hadover bibav mitzia. Why? Dinei mominis. There are the way Dayanim and Ashkenaz, the way that, but there's no hilchas. Dinei mominis Ashkenazios, right? Dinei mominis is basically seichel according to hilchas mominis. Again, you may get your sources. The Ram is a bar seichel. He knows very nicely Dinei mominis. So again, it's an area where he can be helpful. And that, so again, just shows you how, what I would say, discerning the Ohr Zarua was in terms of using his sources. He didn't just cite the kitchen sink. He used people as he needed them. And even the Rambam, who hadn't been used so much till then in Germany, a little bit more, but not so much, he used the Rambam. Interesting, by the way, we don't know too many Talmidim of the Ohr Zarua. One of them was Maharam Rutenberg, except Maharam learned with him when he was a very young man. I think even before his bar mitzvah, maybe he was 13, maybe he was 12, maybe he was 15, the very beginning. Doesn't quote him a lot. Was not his most influential Rebbe at all. His most influential rebbeim were in France, because that's where people went. At that point, there was very little left in Germany. But the Marami Rutenberg uses the Ram a lot more. I'm not saying he necessarily got it from the Ohr Zarua, but that's when things really change. But that's the end of the period of Balatos. So again, Talmidim, otherwise we don't know much. He did have one very good Talmud. That was his son, who also learned with Marami Rutenberg. So if you learn with the Ohr Zarua, Marami Rutenberg, so that's Neshatin. I mean, you're going to be now. The Ohr Zarua, the Maharach Ohr Zarua, why is he called? It's Moreno Harav Chaim, right? Maharach Ohr Zarua. His middle name may have been Eliezer. Some use it, some don't use it. But anyway, why is he called the Ohr Zarua Jr.? The answer is because he wrote the Ohr Zarua Jr. Namely, the son Reb Chaim had Givaldig Kibrov, and he realized his father is Gadol Shebigdolim, and he also realized that except for slightly nutty people like me and my students and people who are going to listen to this and big Lamdonim, not me, not everybody can go through the Ohr Zarua. It's too long, too gross. So he wrote what's called Kitzur Ohr Zarua, Ohr Zarua HaKatzar, Piskei Ohr Zarua, many different titles. But basically, he distills out what I'll call, if the Ohr Zarua goes on for 4 pages, he's got 8 lines. Punchlines, halachic punchlines, usually with a little hesber. In other words, not just paskin this way, paskin. Very well done. The same way the Ohr Zarua was Mayrich, the Ben was Makatzer. Very helpful. You'll see it quoted in Hagos Mordechai, Aleph Zayin Shmetche Kuf, Ohr Zarua Kotan or Kotzer. Right? People don't know what that is. What's the azak? It sounds like the alarm. It's the Ohr Zarua Kotzer. Rabbi Bloy, Olav HaSholem, who published the Burgundy volumes, published a number of Ohr Zarua, much of Marach Ohr Zarua's material. Luckily for us, and most of it's in Kisveyat, luckily for us, the Machon Yerushalayim edition of the Ohr Zarua has on every siman, in a little inside margin, a little different type, the Kitzur Ohr Zarua, what the Marach Ohr Zarua did. So you get the Hanoah. It's not all the Kisveyat. It's very good. It's very, very helpful. And by the way, the Marach Ohr Zarua also published wonderful tshuvas that were issued in a very nice edition, Eretz Olam Riyazah by Abaton, including some new tshuvas. In a number of tshuvas, they ask him, "What did your father hold?" We're not clear. We're not clear what your father held. His tabachtu barichut. I mean, they don't say it that way. It's very respectful. And the son calls the question. He calls the question. Marach Ohr Zarua also gave drushes, where he does basically like the Sefer Achinuch, or like the Sheiltis, or like Rabbi Katz. He gives you basic Shabbos Parshias halachas too. So the son was a very good people person. He was a very good Tzibur Harachav person. He really wanted to. So I don't think he minded being called a Marach Ohr Zarua. That was his job. In other words, Karya the letter of the father. So that's what the Marach Ohr Zarua does. And luckily, again, thanks to Machon Yerushalayim, we now have much more of it than we used to have. Interestingly, there's a master's written on the Ohr Zarua in Hebrew, by a from fellow named Uzi Fuchs, Fuchs, but they call him Fuchs in Israeli Hebrew. In 1996, he has about 30 pages, a wonderful treat. The first 30 pages, a wonderful treatment of the Ohr Zarua's rebbeim. Very beautiful. Then his manche, who I won't mention, a very great Israeli scholar, still alive, Baruch Hashem, wanted to do Yerushalmi. So the rest of the dissertation is Ohr Zarua and Yerushalmi. Now, it makes sense because the Ohr Zarua learned with Rabbi Yehuda Sir Leon in Paris, who was a big French Yerushalmi man. He had more Yerushalmi there than anybody before him. And he learned with the Ravia, whose father, Rabbi Yoel and the Ravia, they got tons of Yerushalmi. So what the Ohr Zarua does with Yerushalmi is taka worthy of a dissertation, but I wish he would have let him do his doctorate. He didn't do it. I have a doctorand who wants to work on the Ohr Zarua, and I'm going to let him. But the truth is, we're talking about it. You need like a team. One of my colleagues in Israel said, we got to have a little machon ha'Ohr Zarua because you got to cover all these different angles. So we have no dissertation yet, no book. We do have, by the way, I should mention, he was my teacher, Olav Shalom in Mesivta. He was not my Rebbe there, but he taught me English, and he was talking, learning. His name's Rav Noah Goldstein, Zal, died very young. He did a DHL, I think, at Yeshiva on the Marach Ohr Zarua, 1960. It's still a very good work. In other words, we actually have more in print about the Ohr Zarua of the Marach than we do about the Ohr Zarua himself in terms of his life. Because it's also a complicated life because he also moved around the Marach and he's living in a different period. It's already a much more difficult period, but that's what we have. So we don't have a lot of English. Now, you want to read again the Ohr Zarua on Tumah V'Tara stuff I have in my peering, and I have the Ohr Zarua, in my book on Mishumodim, I have a ton of stuff from the Ohr Zarua. Again, he's got it. He's got an opinion on everything, or he's got a ket on everything, where he quotes his, Mikodmav. So Simcha Manuel Eretz Yisrael has written. In fact, he wrote recently on the Kisvei. He writes, of course, exclusively in Hebrew, most things in Hebrew. But we need more work on the Ohr Zarua. But you can see why. It's not an easy tiger to tame, as we would say, to use a phrase.
Okay, so I mentioned, the Marach Ohr Zarua, was it the Chuvas? It's like a tall black volume? It's not around anymore, as far as I know. It's not around.
Hard to get.
Maybe the old print sometimes still comes up. The old,
right. So I have in the house the old one, but I have access. The libraries have the new one, and he's got some new Chuvas Mikitve Yad. He also has a copy of those droshes. There are a couple of different copies. There's one somebody else published it separately in Eretz Yisrael, but we have.
Yeah, so that not much in the show's notes. I'll try to link to you, like you said, your book Peering Through Lattices, Brothers from Afar. That's the new one, right? And then I'll try to put a link to the Machon Yerushalayim Israel, but it should be widely available. 3 volumes, read. That's widely available. So you mentioned what there is. You mentioned this thing you mentioned from your teacher. What did you say his name is? Goldstein. Is that available? People can check that out.
No, you have to go to the YU library and ask for it.
You don't know if it's online.
I doubt it. It was done at a time where the Hebrew writing he quoted something, he filled it in with a beautiful, one of those fountain pens. In other words, and he was very masuder. If I would have done it, it would have looked like an ink stain. He did it beautifully.
And I checked, as far as I know, I think only Machon Yerushalayim. I don't think there's like an extensive hakdam on their mavoy in there either. I don't think they did.
No, there's not.
Maybe about the Kisvei Yad.
Yeah. What's that? The Kisvei Yad?
I think it talks about the Kisvei Yad. I know the
it doesn't talk much about. Urbach has a chapter again. This Masters by Uzi Fuchs. It's readable Hebrew. You do 30 pages. All his rebbeim, and that might be somehow more accessible. I might even have a PDF. I have to look. I might even have a PDF. The question is, can I give it to you? I don't have to find out who I can give it to or not. But what can I say? It's a very, very interesting. Again, for all that we know, a lot that we don't know.
Okay, so there's that, and we'll find out. And I'll put up what links again. Whatever links I could, I'll put up in the show's notes. And also, I mentioned here at the end, once we're getting to the end for the listeners. Last time we did the Mordechai, this time we did the Ohr Zarua. If there's people should email me or you, but email me if they want, especially if they're interested in hearing. Should we do more next episode? Should we do another halacha one or something more about this?
One of the Ma'azinim, as they call them in Israel, one of the Ma'azinim, I think, told either you or me, maybe a little bit on Balei Atos ala Torah, which is that's a yam sheyesh lo sof, but the sof is very sof hakovet lovo. That's a possibility, but I'm happy to hear from the Ma'azinim. I'll do what people would like and what you would like. So
yeah, even because even that, like, is it just broad about this or are we doing Bachar Shar one episode?
Right. How to do it, how to break it down. Yeah.
What is it on? So okay, so listen, I'm just throwing it out there for listeners can reach out and give feedback 100%. On what they're interested in hearing about, or because we have Bal Halacha, we've mentioned the Ravya, the Raiva, the Machzavitchi, the Rekeach. There's so many of other ones that we didn't get to. So
I would like to say I'm ready to go, but I have to work hard. So we'll do it. We'll do it. I mean, I'm interested in all of those, but we'll do it Bahadraga. We'll do it as we can. So.
Absolutely. So I want to thank you for joining me. I want to thank Gluck Plumbing again. I mentioned that. I want to thank you for joining me once again.
Thank you. And people don't realize you are extremely well prepared. I mean, I do this. This is what I do all day and all night. Kinahara, Yashikoach. You are. We talked, a little bit on by email, whatever. Everything you asked me was something that you should have asked. In other words, how you figured it all out, I don't know. But Tov Olecha Bracha, Yashikoach. Terrific.
Halavai, I should know as much as you, but at least I'm prepared to ask the question.
You're doing terrific. Baruch Hashem. All right, everybody should have a Freilich and Purim. We should hear Yeshuos. Jitamir should go back to a place where they're publishing Jewish Sefarim. That's what they should be doing in Jitamir. None of that other stuff or some other such thing. Baruch Shalom should help. Okay.
Amen. Okay, thanks for joining once again. Hopefully the listeners learned about the Ohr Zarua.
I hope so. Thank you, Kol Tov. Be well, everybody. Thank you.